Thanks, Roger. Rocky Mountain National Park, which is about 50 or 60 miles from here, for those people who haven't been in this area. Very high elevations for the lower 48 at least. And when I got to the park in 1981, we had had some backcountry toilet issues, or human waste management issues, I should say, that we're starting to build. It's a very common story for a lot of areas. Visitation spiked late 70s, backcountry use became more popular, the Front Range became a lot more populated. We've probably added a couple million people to the Front Range of Colorado in the last several decades. So what used to be kind of a fairly quiet thing to climb Longs Peak became very, very popular starting in the early 80s. So the toilet facilities that we had there were inadequate. And you can see from this slide, not a lot of place to put a toilet. It's pretty much all rocks. It's aptly named the Boulder Field. And this elevation is just below 13,000 feet in this particular slide here where the people are. So one of my charges when I got to the park almost 30 years ago was find something that would solve this problem. So what we did is we developed ultimately a solar dehydrating toilet, and the areas that we did this, down here in Longs Peak, there are 3 separate areas that we have the solar toilets, and then where we'll go on Sunday is Gem Lake. Gem Lake is all rock, no place to dig a pit, and same down in Longs Peak, not really any place to use a conventional pit toilet. And this just zooms in and shows you a little bit better where they are. But, you know, almost 13,000 feet at the Boulder Field, 11.4 at Chasm, and 11.7 at Chasm Junction. People go up on Longs Peak. A lot of people drive the I-25 corridor, see Longs Peak. It's popular to do 14ers here in Colorado, and this is one of the most accessible to people on the Front Range. Some of our challenges were high seasonal use. We get about 500 people a day that make it as far as the Boulder Field, some days even more than that. And I mentioned there's no place really to dispose of any kind of waste or end product on the site. And then the environment's pretty extreme. Winter winds have been clocked over 240 miles an hour up there. And then high ultraviolet and just the challenges of being 6.5 miles into the Boulder Field. So that's the way it was done back in the day. This is Chasm Meadows, one of the few places you could dig a pit up there. The pits would be very shallow. And after you know, a year or two, these would get filled up. And after a while, that meadow just looked like bomb craters all over from where it had been dug out. So in the 1970s, we started doing the euphemistically named honey bucket process. We'd basically have a little toilet up there, and people would do their business directly in the bucket, and then we'd fly the bucket out. Unfortunately, late 1970s, this accident prompted us to take a good look at the helicopter fly-out system. Nobody injured in this, but a little $1 million mistake there on the machine itself. And pretty hazardous flying environment up around 13,000 feet, don't have a lot of density altitude to be lifting stuff out. Had a couple accidents where the buckets were spilled, and anyway, by about 1980, the park was searching for other solutions. So in 1983, we worked with the Public Health Service, and basically, there are about half a dozen parks in the Parks Service at that time that were having similar problems, Voyagers, Yosemite, Crater Lake, and all that, several others. And Public Health Service basically wrote us a blank check and said, go out and learn what works, what doesn't work, make a few mistakes, and we'll put together a big report and study you know, things to do or not to do. And we were fortunate enough to participate in the program and created a program that's been in use since 1983. First iteration was this concept of dehydrating. We didn't think we would do very well. Composting at 13,000 feet, too cold in the winter. The pile temperatures would crash. Very difficult to keep the thing heated. But we have an extremely seasonal use. Longs Peak is really only climbable to non-technical people for about 8 weeks a year. Sometime in July, the ice melts off the upper mountain, and you can climb it without crampons or an ice axe. So the desire to deal with this very seasonal use directed our efforts. Now, we might have been able to get a composting toilet that would have worked at that altitude and with those temperatures. That we put in a lot of solar panels and super insulated everything. But the reality of keeping that through the winter with those 200-mile-an-hour winds, we thought was pretty unrealistic. The other problem with a composter is composters like very even temperatures. The bugs are unhappy with severe spikes in input, and with this seasonal use, we didn't feel that we get very good results. So anyway, we focused on the dehydrator, and this just gives you an idea how it works, basically. The liquids and the solids are separated just with a perforated bucket. Some of the toilets have an actual urinal here, and that goes straight to the liquids. The liquids are taken down to a liquid evaporator. It's just a series of trays with swamp cooler pads. And then the solids are dried by this solar hot air panel here. It's all pulled through by a photovoltaic panel. So there's a pretty good velocity of air coming over these solids. If we didn't have this high seasonal use, we'd be pretty effective. We'd get probably 70% of the solid waste reduced, or the weight of it. But with our seasonal use from somewhere in July through August and early September, we have a more difficult time because the input is so high that we can't really keep ahead of it. But for the rest of the year, it does pretty well, and virtually all the liquids are evaporated, so a lot of that weight is gone as well. This just shows you a picture of that first generation. There's the hot air panel. Hot air comes through it, circulates through the vault, dries the solids. This line goes down to the liquids evaporator. And you can see at the Boulder Field we had 2 of those evaporators, and you can see this is a great photo to show you what our environmental challenges up there. There's no place to get rid of any have trenches or anything like that. There's no soil at all for any kind of digestion of the waste. And this is a close-up of the tray evaporator. These trays all pull out. We put swamp cooler pads on them, and the liquid is wicked up into the airflow. We have enough wind up there, and it's good and sunny. It's actually fairly hot on a lot of days, and so we're pretty successful at getting rid of all the liquid. The liquid is actually, or these trays are set up in a cascade function that you have to flood the first one, the top one, before the liquid will get to the second. And so by the time you get to the 10th tray, which we might do in, say, mid-August when the use is so high, but much of the summer we're only going to flood the first 3 or 4 trays up there. And again, if it's sized correctly, it'll get rid of all the liquid waste. And then we use a photovoltaic powered fan to draw air through. This is just a computer fan, basically. And we have a maintenance worker goes up, services each toilet. We have 4 in the park. They do Gem Lake one day. They go to Chasm Junction and Chasm Meadows another day, and then they service the Boulder Field on a third day, and sometimes they make another trip or 2 up there in the high season. It's not a fun task, but I tease the people that work for me over the years that, well, you get paid in scenery on this job, and you've got about 10 minutes of misery, and then you got a pretty good job the rest of the day. I should mention that waste goes to a regular treatment plant, Upper Thompson Sanitation District, and Estes Park takes care of that for us.
How are those baskets dumped?
We don't actually dump it. We just shovel it out directly into panniers for llamas. You'll see the llamas here. These llamas are trained to be pack animals. They're not pets. And so we can get about 80 pounds per llama. High season, we might actually do that. Most of the rest of the summer, we're probably not going to take that much weight out with each one of them. But they just, the maintenance worker just basically shovels the solids out of the basket into plastic bags, triple bags it, puts it in pannier, and works pretty well. The llama is very even-tempered, and their hooves don't destroy the trail like horses in this environment tend to chew up the trail a lot more than llamas would. This public health service experiment I mentioned earlier, we also ran it in 1984. We built this thing. It wasn't too sexy, but it worked real well. It actually had tray labyrinths on the solids as well. And once a solids tray filled up, we'd rake it down, pull it off to the side, and then these 3 solar panels, hot air panels, would dry the 2 racks of these things. And we found this worked so well, you could probably get rid of about 90% of the waste, but the problem was it was a real pain to do maintenance on, because it would kind of sit down into the perforated trays and have to be kind of scraped out with a shovel. So even though it was less offensive and much more effective, one of the lessons we learned over the years was anything that required a lot of maintenance at that altitude, and after a 6.5-mile hike in, you're just going to have a real hard time convincing a maintenance worker that they really needed to be doing this kind of thing, because they would actually rather deal with a quicker, easier, and somewhat more offensive thing with a bucket than the lighter results of this thing. So anyway, one of the lessons we learned was making things as simple as possible at that altitude. And so here's some of the lessons. Ease of maintenance was probably our biggest thing. The people that we have servicing, these are not mountaineers. They're maintenance people that like to hike, basically. And I've been there many times myself. The time you hike out there, a few hours, and you're 13,000 feet. Your brain's a little not function as well, and just to replace a hinge or something takes a little more energy, brain energy. And so what we found is the more bulletproof we could make it in terms of maintenance, and the simpler it was, the better results we had. Marmots were a real challenge, something we hadn't really thought about, but they would eat through it. I'll show you the pictures in a second. Corrosion resistance, we learned that lesson early on. And then the winter winds are, as I mentioned, pretty tremendous up there. So we, on successive generations, we improved these things. So just quickly, these are some of the things that we learned. These are, marmots would actually chew through the plywood to get inside the vault. Did a lot of damage. Corrosion and wind damage. These 2 different generations of toilets, and every time, started out with 1/8-inch cables, went to 3/16, and now I've got 1/4-inch cables. So some of the stuff we did to make it survive a little better. Put hardware cloth over all the surfaces, and then we put fiberglass on top of that, and that worked pretty well to keep the marmots out. And for corrosion, we went with everything is stainless steel now, or polyethylene. That works pretty well to keep that down. And then wind is just a matter of beefing up all the components. So this is kind of what we have nowadays. This is what we have at the Boulder Field. We actually have 2 separate toilets there, so we can close one for cleaning. We have as many people as 500 people a day will get here. And so we basically have two separate toilets. Plus we have camping there. So this pretty well takes care of the use that we have. Haven't had anybody complain too much about the side-by-side aspect. In fact, the only complaint I've had is that the toilet seat faces to the north, and people said, "Well, why don't you face it the other way so that we could look at the mountain?" So, and this is what we have in Chasm Meadows. Put a bunch of different pictures there of the same thing, but this is one of the latest ones we've built, and it's survived pretty well. There's the hot air panel. You can see the inlet right there. This is the stainless steel pipe that leads it into the vault. Inside the vault, there's the solids basket that separates out the liquids, and the air goes through that, and then it exits on the opposite side via this fan. And on this one, the photovoltaic that powers the fan is actually down on the evaporator, and it's running a conduit up here. And this is the latest generation of the liquids evaporator. We increased the height of it a little bit to give a little more chance for the air to get through. And you can see the liquids pipe that comes down from the tray that's underneath the solids basket that separates out the liquid, and then it comes down here. And you'll see it coming in the back. And then there's the photovoltaic panel on top for the fan.
You have to set up that yearly?
I'm sorry?
You have to set that up yearly?
No, it's all over winters. Yeah, the maintenance worker will come in the spring, and sometimes we'll be, the vault itself will have snow in it. Spindrift up there is horrendous. There's no way to prevent spindrift from getting in any of this stuff, so we just basically let it go. And then we don't really have much use until sometime in June, so the hot air eventually will melt everything out. By about mid-June, it's up and running. How about I'll...
Let's hold off on questions until...
Yeah, I only got one or two more slides, and then we'll answer all those questions. So here's the things we learned in terms of being successful as commitment to maintenance. Every few years, we get a new maintenance supervisor for this operation. I hear that the toilet's not working, and I'm like, well, I wonder why it's not working. It's been there for nearly 30 years and seemed to work. Well, it turns out it wasn't an issue of it not working. It was an issue that a solar panel was broken, or a fan was didn't make it through the winter, or the battery that's associated with the fan didn't make it through the winter. So I get these, every so often I get this pushback that it's too much maintenance. Well, it's pretty hard to get much less maintenance, but there's going to be a desire sometimes to have these totally maintenance-free operations, and in my opinion, in an environment like we have, that's not really likely to happen. And then in our case, for dehydrators at least, you need a place to dispose of the waste. Now, we didn't have any soil, so we pack it out. Some systems, if you had local soil conditions, you might be able to do something with the end product. Availability of replacement parts. Every once in a while I'll get a call from some place, like I've been approached in Asia, for places in Asia and Africa. And I've been a little reluctant to suggest something like this, because if a solar panel fails or a fan fails, it's very difficult sometimes to get a replacement part here in the U.S., where I can get something FedEx the next night, let alone some places in the world where it might be weeks before you can get a replacement part. And then the skills to build the specialized components. Now, the folks outside have a dehydrator, and that might be worth investigating. We did ours entirely from scratch. And anyway, you have to be able to create these specialized components one way or the other, either by a contractor or by buying an off-the-shelf thing. And then again, in terms of exporting this to other places, some places, and we talked briefly, I think, about this in New Zealand, I believe, where local customs might not be conducive to pull and open a vault and shoveling the waste out. So this is my soapbox here for a second here. When you push that little chrome lever there, where does it go? And so my soapbox for this whole conference is there's no panaceas. Anything you do is going to have some commitment to maintenance, going to have some commitment to keeping this thing going. Almost any system is going to work for a year or two, but if you don't keep up with it, it's not going to survive. So we kind of get inured by that little chrome lever. When you flush something here, it goes to a treatment plant. So our end result goes down to the Upper Thompson Sanitation District. So we don't get around that. The physics are still there. Even at 90% efficiency, you're still going to have an end product that's got to be dealt with one way or the other.
Your fans, how often do you have to replace them, and do you have a reasonable replacement that holds up for a year or two?
Yeah, it's a good question. The fans do burn out, and they'll get ice inside them, and then the photovoltaic, charges up the battery, and then it tries to start it, and it'll burn itself out that way. So they're just DC computer fans, and once we have the actual structure, you can actually replace the fan pretty easy. But again, that's one of those maintenance things. I have a hard time, convincing the maintenance supervisor that all you need to do is go to the Granger catalog and you can find that thing.
So you basically plan on replacing it about every spring?
It's total hit or miss. Sometimes you go 3 or 4 years, no real needs, and then sometimes it'll be year after year.
I was just wondering about the swamp cooler pads on the evaporator and what sort of maintenance those required every year or whatnot.
The maintenance on the swamp cooler?
Yeah.
We just replace the pads about once a year. Pretty straightforward.
Do you have any issues with the tube plugging up that's coming from for the liquid waste into the swamp cooler?
Sometimes we have to replace the tube will clog or something. We have to replace it every few years. We used to have a lot of problems with UV degradation on the plastic tube. Now we put it in electrical conduit, and that's taking care of that. But you have to be careful to clear the solids. Don't all stay in the bucket, and some get down in the liquids, and then you have to be careful to clear that out.
Couple of questions. You said, I think 500 people per day was the peak?
Yeah, that'd be the peak, yeah.
Okay, and you said that sometimes the use kind of exceeds the capacity to be able to treat it. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, if you look at Boulder Field, we might have 10,000 uses a year for those 2 toilets. But probably 80% of that comes in about 8 weekends, sometime between July and September, depending when the snow melts off the peak. So we have this, we kind of have 2 spikes. One is a seasonal spike in July and August, but then we also have just during the week, we'll have more on the weekend. So there's no way the system keeps up with it on the weekend. We'd have to build something 4 times as big just to be ahead of it.
And then the other question is this area, is this a designated wilderness area?
It is, yeah. And these were put in before we were formally designated as wilderness, but in our wilderness plan, and maybe Jim Dugan back here can answer that question a little better, but basically it says facilities that are appropriate can be maintained within the wilderness. Now, if we were starting from scratch, we'd have some real serious discussion about this, I'm sure. But if you look at it's a net gain to the environment. If I'm taking 10,000 uses out of the Boulder Field, and we're not putting all that urine and all that feces into the water, it's just underneath those rocks, it's definitely a net gain for the wilderness. And that's one reason these toilets are so minimal. If you look at the size, they're not real sexy on the architecture. And one of the reasons is to minimize its visual profile so that we're in the wilderness.
The 2 toilets that you had that were side by side,
Yeah.
the solids have to be packed out annually from those, I assume?
No, we go there, service those weekly.
Oh, they're
Yeah.
packed out weekly.
Yeah, we pack out weekly. Now, early season, we're not taking that much out. On high season, we'll definitely take, we have at least 2 llamas that go up there and we'll load up both of them.
And have you done any sampling of the solids that are coming out of there as far as pathogens and?
It's nasty stuff. We
Still.
haven't bothered because we're taking it straight to the, a regular sewage treatment plant. We just take it to the transfer station where we take the sludge from vault toilets.
Okay. And then the last question is, why the fiberglass over the hardware cloth? Why the fiberglass
Oh, why the fiberglass?
over the hardware cloth?
Just to protect it. It's just plywood, and then we put the hardware cloth over that to keep the marmots from chewing through. And then we put the fiberglass over that to keep the UV degradation down on the plywood in the wind. And I've actually seen the 4x4 corners on the screen, the privacy screen. After 10 years of winter wind, they're not 4x4s, they're 2 1/4 by 4s. So literally it'll braid the fine sands and whatnot from the winter winds. Will braid that plywood down to nothing over a few years. It's pretty amazing.
Are you able to effectively control odors both outside the toilet and the evaporator system?
Yeah, if you approach you're right on top of the evaporator, it's not going to be a pleasant experience. And as far as right on the toilet, we put those vents up pretty high, and it's usually fairly windy, so it's not too offensive. One reason we went, the early version was a regular sandy pot sort of structure, and we found that those privacy screens actually work better for the odor because you're just wide open.
So you said that all of these were put in before it was formally designated as wilderness. And my question is, are there other problem areas where you guys are considering putting in another composter? And do you have a discussion of other alternatives other than, or not composter, I'm sorry, one of these dehydrating toilets?
Yeah, Mills Lock Junction, for example, it's only, what, Jim, 2 miles in?
Roughly that,
Yeah. We're looking, it's very, very high use, but it's down in the trees. So we're looking at options there. It actually brings up a good point. This is not a good system to use into trees. It wouldn't be a good system up in the Pacific Northwest, for example, where you don't have as much sun. So we might entertain other options down in the trees. We might be able to work with a composter, for example, because we'd actually have soil there to work with.
Let me just follow that up with, just considering, continually increased use for Rocky, Yosemite, a lot of national parks that have designated wilderness. Can you imagine another area and another area getting so impacted with use that you have these being the expected norm in almost any trail that you go to? And it's just something for all of us to consider when we're considering these options.
Yeah, and I think that's a whole nother conference, frankly, is how much is appropriate use. I do a lot of river rafting, and I don't have any problem. I complain about it that I can't get a permit, but I don't have any problem that they limit the number of people that can go on a given river. Longs Peak, we've been loath to go to a permit system, but I think some places have already gone to that, and you have to make a management call on what's appropriate. If we didn't have these systems up there, we would have 15,000 you-know-whats along the trail, bombs along the trail somewhere. And so we view this as a net gain, but nobody's been willing to take the political heat and say enough is enough on the Longs Peak corridor. We're not at the point where we're so overwhelmed that we can't deal with it now, but if we were to double it, I think you'd be into that question, and certainly a lot of other parks are at that point already.